Thank you, everybody. I'm happy to be here today. I hope everybody's having a wonderful Friday. It's a beautiful day here in Hays County. I'm going to talk with you about financial cost sharing opportunities. This is a pretty broad topic like all of these. And so I'm going to hit some highlights. And if you walk away from this or close your browser from this and can remember the names of these programs and where to go to find out more information, that's really the goal today. I want to give you a real brief overview of some of these. And you're on the right screen. Okay. I always like to mention when I talk about incentives for conservation, Texas's open space tax valuation. That is probably our largest and arguably most successful incentive for conservation in the state. If you've got an ag or a wildlife tax appraisal or timber appraisal in East Texas, then you understand the value of this tax incentive. And it is a real incentive for conservation. Its intent is to keep open space lands open. From a wildlife management perspective, the wildlife appraisal specifically requires you to do wildlife management activities. And as of 2019, there's over 6 million acres in the state that's under wildlife management appraisal. That's a lot of land that's incentivized with this tax benefit to property tax benefit to do wildlife management practices. Big major incentive program, and one that's fairly easy for everybody to tap into if you own rural land. On an entirely separate topic, anytime I mention that, I want to make sure that people understand that despite those big tax benefits, open space tax valuations do pay for themselves. Those lands pay more in taxes than they take in government resources. And so it is a net win all around. If you think you're not taking advantage of conservation incentives, if you're in open space valuation, you already are. Excuse me. My allergies are getting me this week. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about two programs through Texas Parks and Wildlife, Landowner Incentive Program, or LIP, and Pastures for Upland Birds, also known as PUB. I'm going to briefly mention these last two, the Grassland Restoration Incentives Program, and then a couple of NRCS programs, just so you're aware that they exist and can get more information later. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on those, but I want to give you a little more detail on LIP and PUB. Those are two programs that I find people aren't as familiar with as some of these other more traditional incentive programs. So LIP is a cost share funding program. Virtually all of these that I'm going to talk about are cost share programs. So they're not going to pay 100% of your project costs, but they are going to cover a significant portion. In the case of LIP, that's usually between 50 and 75% of the total project cost that you can get reimbursed for. The good news is that your contribution, your share of the cost, doesn't have to be cash out of pocket. It can be materials, it could be in-kind contributions of labor or equipment that can contribute to your portion of the cost share. So it doesn't necessarily have to come right out of your pocket. The payments on this and a lot of these others are based on the NRCS payment schedules. These are published schedules. They vary from year to year a little bit. These are two of the more recent ones I could find. I think these are 2020 reimbursement rates. I think they're current still. And so as an example, if you were under LIP, if you were to, your project was to plant vegetation to benefit pollinators, you could be reimbursed about $158 per acre for that practice. If you were doing brush management, this is herbicide treatments. IPT is individual plant treatment. And say mesquite or prickly pear, that's about $34 per acre reimbursement rate, I think as of 2020. So it's not 50% of whatever you say the cost is going to be. There are some ceilings. There's kind of set prices that they'll reimburse at for a lot of these practices. And the nice thing about LIP is there's no minimum project size. These can be very small targeted projects. The example they use on their website is a small spring that they excluded livestock from. to allow vegetation to regrow. So very small scale project, but with lots of benefits for that area. So there's no, it may be a few $1,000s is all that project costs, but you can still get reimbursement under LIP potentially to share some of that cost. Awards generally don't exceed about $40,000 in reimbursement. So that's kind of the high end you could expect. But most of these projects are going to be somewhere in between there. So how do they decide what programs to fund? LIP currently has 3 funding series active. The Watershed funding series, that is based on these priority watersheds. This map you see on the right, those gray areas are the current priority watersheds for the LIP watershed funding series. So if you're in that gray area, you're in a priority area that covers, as you can see, most of the Edwards Plateau and the Hill Country. So most of you are probably within that gray zone. The top projects are going to be projects in that gray zone that directly benefit Endangered Species Act listed species. So whatever your project is, if you can tie that benefit to an ESA listed species and you're in that gray area, you're going to be at the top of the list as far as LIP is concerned. Next level priority is going to be listed or candidate ESA species outside those gray areas. So if you're in the white zone there, those areas that aren't shaded in on that map, you can still get LIP funding. And again, if your project's benefiting an ESA listed or candidate species, that's going to raise your priority level. And that last here is just state or federal trust species. So these are other species of concern. There's a lot of them to choose from. The most iconic would be probably the Texas horned lizard. That's a state threatened species. If your project's benefiting Texas horned lizard, then you're still going to be up on that kind of 3rd tier priority for LIP funding. This series has a application date, as it were. It's not a hard date, but the pre-proposals generally are going to be due in February of each year. For 2021, that's February 12th. The pre-proposal is simple, 1 to 2 pages, outline your project. That lets them quickly run through and decide which projects might be a high priority for further proposals and possible funding. The Conserving Texas River Series is a different pool of funding for LIP. It's targeting riparian zones and uplands in these listed watersheds here, Rio Grande, Llano, Pedernales, and Blanco. So if you're in one of those watersheds, you don't have to have riparian frontage. You don't have to have river frontage to qualify, because the uplands can count too. If you're in one of those watersheds, you might be eligible in this series. And this is a continuous enrollment, so you can apply at any time. They're basically spending money until they run out. The license plate series is funded by all of you wonderful people that may have spent a little extra money each year to get one of the conservation license plates. The first of which was that horned lizard plate you see here. That money goes to funding this LIP series, and it's really targeted at high priority species of greatest conservation need. That's SGCNs, right? These are listed in our state wildlife action plan. And then there's a sub list that are considered high priority for this series in particular. The most well-known of which is probably the monarch butterfly. So if you're doing a project that benefits monarchs, this may be a series where you can get some funding through LIP. And these are selected from Watershed series, that first series I talked about, those applicants. So if you submit that pre-proposal and you're not selected for the Watershed series, you may, again, if your target fits that conservation license plate series, you may get selected for that other series. So you've got maybe multiple levels that you can get funded, or you might get selected for funding. So what do you do with LIP? This is a list of common things that are done with LIP funding. I can tell you they do try to avoid paying for fencing. That's one thing that Tim Sigma at TPWD pointed out. And not that they haven't, but they're generally not trying to spend money on fencing. But all these other projects are potential LIP projects, and these practices are things that most of these cost share programs are going to help pay for in some manner. So this is a good list in general to think about, from brush management to invasive species control, and even planting, reseeding, or planting native vegetation to benefit those target species. And you can see here on that bottom right picture, that's a woodland brush management project. Looks like they did some understory thinning, most likely for the benefit of golden cheek warbler. So that would be a good example of a lip project potentially. So I include this picture. This is a lip project. I put it in here because most of you, all of you, have probably seen a pasture that looks like this. Many of you may have pastures that look like this. And so if you're wondering, well, what does a lip project site look like? This is it. This is one of them. This property is on the Blanco River, and a combination of practices here of brush management, mesquite control. It's fairly low density in this pasture, which is good already, but they're going to do some brush management and then some reseeding, range enhancement, planting for pollinators and grassland birds as well as part of their lip project. Here's the process. In general, I mentioned that pre-proposal stage. That gives them, that's kind of a first flush. They can pick out those that look more interesting, that may fit the criteria better. If your project does, they'll ask for a full proposal, which is a little more involved. Then you get to go through, if you're selected, you get to go through all the paperwork and contracting and all that. There is a fair amount of paperwork involved with this. This is federal money, so as you can imagine, there's no shortage of things to fill out and sign. It's not overwhelming, and Parks and Wildlife is there. They want to spend this money. They're there to help you through that process, of course. But so that takes a little bit of time. And then typically by about October of the year, sometime around now, they'd be announcing awarding contracts. And then you get a year or a few years to do the work. Then once that work's complete and verified, that's when you get paid. They're not going to give you money up front to do these projects. They're going to reimburse you for costs. And so once it's done, then you could submit an invoice, and the comptroller cuts you a check. And what's important to note is that this can be done in phases. So if you've got a multi-phase project like brush management followed by reseeding, you could get paid on the completion of a phase. So you do the brush management first, and then you would submit that, verify that work, submit that invoice and get paid for that. And then later, once you've completed the reseeding, you can get reimbursed for that portion of the project. So it's not, it doesn't have to wait until the entire project is complete in all cases. So on to PUB. I like this program a lot, mainly because it's a little easier to manage. It's a little less bureaucratic to deal with, a little less paperwork. It's still federal dollars funneling through Parks and Wildlife, so there's still some to deal with, but a little easier, a little simpler. You can apply at any time for PUB. And this is very targeted. It's focused on grassland restoration in non-native pastures. So this isn't going to pay for brush management or some of those other things that I listed under LIP. This is very specific to controlling exotic grasses, non-native grasses, and replanting with native plants. That's what this program's for. Originally started with Bermuda grass pastures kind of east of 35, focused on quail and other grassland birds. It's been expanded in the last several years to include much more of the state and focus on things like King Ranch bluestem, which is probably a more common issue for many of you. PUB does have a minimum project size, unlike LIP. You've got to have at least 25 acres. But I have successfully used multiple sites on an individual property to meet that 25 acre requirement. So if you may not have 25 contiguous acres for a project, you may have, say, 3 10-acre sections on your property that might be suitable for this. That might be possible to tie those together and consolidate under one project to meet that 25 acre minimum. So just because you have some scattered small projects, don't think that you're automatically excluded. This program, the reason it's a little simpler is Parks and Wildlife's just giving you supplies. They're going to hand you the herbicide. They're going to hand you the seeds for reseeding. based on an approved seed mix. You and your biologists get to adjust that for your site, what's going to work best. But they've got a list of approved plants. They're going to hand you those seeds, and sometimes, if it's available, you can use one of the no-till drills that Parks and Wildlife might have. I wouldn't count on that, just it's often occupied, so I'd suggest if you're doing this, you find a contractor that can do rangeland drilling without having to worry about that, borrowing that drill. But if you're doing it on your own, you've got your own equipment, don't mind drilling, you might have access to one of Parks and Wildlife's. You provide the equipment and the labor, and you do it yourself, or you hire a contractor to implement, to do the spraying, to do the reseeding. There's no cash exchange. They're giving you the supplies, you're doing the work. That's how the program works. And it really does. It ends up, and the projects I've done, it ends up covering about half the cost, at least. Half the cost. If you're doing the work on your own, it may cover more than half the cost for you. So again, ends up about 50% cost share at the end of the day because of the expense of herbicide and that seed mix. This is the focal area for PUB. Imagine it covers most of you. If you're in one of those colored counties, then you're eligible to apply for PUB. There's a couple of different funding levels. That's the color difference. Not worth getting into today, but if you're in any of those colored counties, you might be eligible for PUB. Again, you've got to have a pasture that's suitable for spraying and reseeding, and is dominated by non-native grasses in order to qualify for a project like this. This is an example of a PUB project that we helped a landowner with. This was a fairly clean Bermuda grass hay pasture. That this goes left to right and then top to bottom in time. You can see the dates on here. When we started, that June 21st, 2017 is after obviously a spraying. We got really good kill. They're not 100%. Bermuda grass is pretty tough stuff. You can see that little patch of green. We ended up spraying this field 3 times total, twice in the growing season and then once in the cool season to knock back some of the cool season grasses. And reduce competition for the warm season plants we were going to plant. You can see by August of the next year, about a year later, and this was a very dry year. 2018 was pretty dry. That first growing season was a pretty rough one for this project, but we still got a really good response, especially considering the dry conditions. You can see there in that August 21st, 2018 photo, we got lots of, they're small, but we got lots of native grasses coming up, native bunch grasses popping up in there. And that's normal. These things take time. The saying goes, the first year they sleep, second year they creep, third year they leap. And that's what we're seeing now. If you jump to that July 7th, 2020, that's this summer. This pasture looks very different, very diverse, lots of native warm season grasses, big and little blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass in abundance, American basket flower, and lots of cool season wildflowers as well. So been a really strong success. We've been blessed with some good rains over the course of these 3 years, and it's responded really well. Landowners seeing lots of additional use by the wild turkey in the area, songbirds, deer heavily using this pasture. There's lots of fawning and bedding areas in this pasture now. Been a real success. So that's kind of what a PUB project can look like and the timeline you should expect for results. I'm going to mention these last few really briefly, mainly just so you know their names, you know they exist. The GRIP program, Grassland Restoration Incentives Program. This is through the Oaks and Prairies joint venture. You can see the target area here in the map on the right. That yellow area is the focal area. If you're in that yellow area, you could be eligible, but they are really focused on those green outlined counties. So those are going to get highest priority for this program. But just because you're not in one, if you're in that yellow area, you still might qualify for the GRIP program. These are direct payments for grassland habitat improvement, things like prescribed grazing, prescribed burning, brush management, reseeding, A lot of the things we've already talked about. This one, again, is based on the NRCS reimbursement rates. That's how they decide how much money they're going to pay you. It's also got a minimum project size of 25 acres and a 5-year maintenance period. That's what they expect out of you. I didn't mention under LIP and pub as well. Those are typically 10-year contracts. And what that means effectively is don't destroy it. Don't undo everything you did in the next 10 years. It doesn't mean that if it's not successful that you have to give the money back or pay back what you got. It just means don't go in there after 5 years later, do a pub program, don't go in there and plow it back up and respread Bermuda grass. Don't do that. For GRIP, anybody can apply, but these go through the NRCS process. You're going to be dealing with NRCS when you're talking about GRIP and the Oak Grazing Joint Ventures folks. CRP, for those of you who might have cropland, this is one of our oldest and most beneficial programs for those of you who fit that bill. Lots and lots of different practices that can be funded here, but the land generally is going to need a cropping history. So for the last 6 years, typically it needs to have been planted in crops. So you can't have an old cropland that hasn't been planted in 10 years and try to claim CRP. CRP is about renting that land from you to benefit wildlife habitat and conservation rather than having it be in crop production. Ideally on marginal croplands or croplands that aren't as productive for you, this can be a good program. So you can't take stuff that's not being cropped and try to get paid not to crop it. So there are a few practices, that apply to marginal pasture land where it doesn't have to have a cropping history. The most applicable for most of these is probably going to be riparian buffers. It's CP22. That's for protecting and enhancing riparian areas. And again, those areas don't have to have a crop history necessarily, nor does the land around it to qualify for that program. CRP is a rental program, so they're not just necessarily paying you to do the practices, they're renting the land from you so that you don't grow crops or graze it in the case of marginal pasture lands. There's up to a 90% cost payment, incentive payments, sign-up bonuses, lots of potential money here. So this can be a very beneficial program if you qualify for CRP. This is part of the Farm Bill. If you're familiar with any of these programs, it's probably EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program. This one is common. If I run into a landowner that's used a cost share program, it's usually EQIP. And in the Edwards Plateau, it's usually for something like brush management, ash juniper control, things like that. This is generally targeted at agricultural producers, livestock owners. It's not exclusive. If you're not a producer, you should still, if you're interested, talk to NRCS about this program. They've got some leeway locally to put money into projects, even if it's not exclusively for a production operation. This is going to cover things again like brush management, plantings. I've got a landowner in Comal who's used EQIP for cross fencing to facilitate rotational grazing and infrastructure development in the form of additional water sources for livestock to facilitate rotational grazing. They've also used it for brush management and for reseeding on that property. So they've used it for a lot of different projects and have seen a lot of benefits from the EQIP program. Both CRP and EQIP require you to register with the Farm Services Agency, FSA. You can find your local service center at that website. You can also just Google USDA Service Center and you'll find a website with a map to get down to your local office. That's the place to start. You'll have to register with FSA if you're not already, you don't have an account with them. And then you'd work with NRCS to see which programs might fit. Again, there's a lot of them, which is why I'm not going into a lot of detail on those here. And so they're going to match you up with the best potential programs for your property and for your conservation goals. So that's all I've got I'm happy to take questions if we've got time, or we can do that in the panel. Know what you want to do, Daniel?
I think we've got at least one question. Tiffany, I'll let you take it from here.
Yep, I believe we have two. The first is from Janet. What was the herbicide that was used in your pub examples of reseeding to native grasses to remove the existing?
Right, so good question. So the goal there is, again, you're dealing with non-native grasses, so it's to basically start with a clean slate. So what you're going to be using is glyphosate, brand name Roundup. You're going to spray it, you're going to kill everything. And because of that, what you're really looking to start with a pasture that's at least 50% non-native. So if you've got a lot of natives already in your pasture and maybe some King Ranch Blue Stem mixed in, that's not necessarily a good pub project. But if those non-native grasses dominate, the idea is you go in, you kill everything, and you start with as clean a slate as possible and reseed on top of that. You won't kill everything. There's that project. There is still some Bermuda grass out there. It's really hard to eliminate, but it's scattered and the site is much more diverse and dominated by natives now instead of that coastal.
And we do have another question. Are the EQIP programs available to people who don't qualify for limited resource farmer rancher?
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe somebody else does. There is a lot of those EQIPs got an income requirement. It's pretty high. I don't recall offhand what it is, but there is a maximum income requirement that pretty much everybody I know is well below that income requirement. So there is that. That's something that FSA and NRCS would walk you through, but I can't answer that question specifically. Maybe somebody else can.
Shane, yeah, this is Steve Nelly. I can answer that. Yes, EQIP is eligible. You do not have to be a limited resource producer in order to sign up for EQIP. Although, if you are a limited resource producer, minority, or a beginning farmer and rancher, you get higher payment rates. You get considerably higher payment rates, but it's not a requirement for the program.
Thank you, Steve.